Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, released in 1988 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, did what any sensible sequel on the Nintendo Entertainment System did back in the day. It took what came before and tossed it out the window to make way for a totally new thing that was completely different. This upset people because they liked Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 was nothing like Zelda 1, so people hated it for some reason. Or at least that's the story I've always been told. I wouldn't know about that though, because my first venture into The Legend of Zelda was The Adventure of Link. Okay, it was technically that cartoon, but that first game I played was the second game in the series, and it was great! It was also brutally difficult for its day, perhaps even today, except not really, because today you have save states and rewinds and things that make it more tolerable than it was before, but we're not doing that shit here. We're going vintage. Big gold game pack in the old top-loading NES. Or the FC Twin. Or the Retro Strios. Or the Retron 5, or whatever console pops up on screen, because I'm trying to cover all my bases here, because I don't know when I'm actually going to play this on, and also, anyways. The Adventure of Link is a proper sequel to The Legend of Zelda, which means you play as the very same Link who once saved the Princess Zelda by claiming the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom and slaying the demon wizard Ganon to claim his Triforce of Power. Now a much older Link who has grown an extra tile who has to venture out in search of the third Triforce, otherwise known as the Triforce of Courage, or as the original NES release refers to it, number 3 Triforce, in order to break the sleeping spell cast upon Princess Zelda, who is not the same Princess Zelda you saved in the first game, because this Princess Zelda was placed in a sleeping spell ages ago, and then the king decreed that all the royal damsels would be named Zelda. This is actually in the manual. Nobody would have known at the time, but this was Nintendo's way of justifying their reasoning as to why they can release multiple games in the series starring different characters named Zelda. As to why there are multiple heroes named Link who all look the same? Well, I'm sure there was a perfectly plausible reasoning for this that got tossed out the window once Ocarina of Time came along and ruined things with its timeline bullshit, but that's fodder for another year. Zelda 2 starts you off in the castle, and a new majestic overworld theme greets you on your way out. Once you exit the castle, you're on the overworld map, which is different looking than the previous game, looking more like one of those RPG overworlds like in Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. Then once you go into a forest or a desert, shadow monsters appear and chase you down. If one of them touches you, you'll have to play a little side level to get out of this ambush. So The Adventure of Link is a side-scrolling action platformer as opposed to the overhead open-world adventure of the previous game. Link can run, he can jump, he can stab things with his sword, and he can deflect most blows with his shield. Later on, Link can learn to stab downwards and upwards by visiting this here knight, both moves vital to survive in later dungeons. And while your sword does shoot a little beam when Link's at full health, it's a little bitty beam with a bit pitiful range and is largely shrugged off by all but the weakest of foes. My advice, don't bother with it and just stick with the close quarters combat because that is the main focus of The Adventure of Link. Unlike in the previous game, you have no secondary weapons to acquire, no boomerangs, no bombs, nothing of the sort. You do gain additional tools, but these are merely means of traversing more of the overworld. A candle to light up caves, a hammer to clear away blockades, a power glove to destroy bricks into palaces, and so on. The focus of the game's combat is almost entirely on swordplay, and learning how to time your blows, especially against shielded foes like the Iron Knuckles or Stalfos, is essential to surviving the perils of this new Hyrule, and is also the one sticking point that either makes or breaks The Adventure of Link, depending on your mileage. Instead of side weapons, Link can learn magic spells by visiting an old wizard who inhabits the various towns. But in order to be allowed to visit some of these wizards, you'll need to complete a side quest of sorts, which usually involves fetching things. There are 8 spells in the game, each with various effects and each vital to your success. Once you've learned a spell, you can select it from the pause menu and press select to execute, provided you have the required magic points. Some spells are instantaneous, such as Life, which is your only real means of healing in the field, or the screen-nuking Thunder spell, while others, such as Shield or Jump, have effects that last until you leave the current room, prompting you to cast the spell again in the next room if you need it, and even then, you can only perform a spell once until you bring up the pause menu again. This keeps you from spamming spells needlessly. In order to improve Link's attributes, you'll need to grind for experience points, which is accomplished by killing certain enemies or grabbing point bags. There are also heart and magic containers that will extend the appropriate meters by 1 block. The idea is to earn enough points to be able to upgrade one of 3 stats: Life, Magic, or Attack. Life increases your defense, it lessens damage received, Magic decreases the cost of magic spells, and Attack increases the damage you inflict upon enemies. Experience gaining and level building differs between the NES and Famicom Disk System versions. In the NES version, each stat has their own point requirements for leveling up, with life levels requiring the least points and attack requiring the most. So you could choose to spend points on life or magic if you have them, or you can hold off and build towards attack. And these levels will stick even after you exhausted all your lives, provided you save your game, of course. The Disk System version is a little simpler. You reach a point value, you can pick any stat to upgrade, which makes it possible to build up one stat immediately to level 8 if that's how you want to play things. There is a bit of a trade-off here, for once you lose all your lives or end your game, all your levels are reset to the lowest level. So you build up your attack levels and magic levels, for example, but your life level is still at level 1, then everything gets reset to level 1 once you lose all your lives and get a game over, and all that grinds for naught. So while the NES setup has a bit more of a grind to it to get to the levels you want to get to, at least when you save your game, your levels will be intact, and that's key. Now, of course, in either case, you lose all your lives, you reset the game, or whatever the case may be, you lose whatever points you have. Something to keep in mind. Oh, and something else to keep in mind? You get a game over, you choose to continue, you restart at North Castle, which means you'll need to make the long trek back to where you died previously in order to continue your progress, which defeats the whole purpose of a continue option. The sole exception of this rule is when you're at the Great Palace, the final palace of the game. You die at that point, you get a game over, you restart at the beginning of the palace, which is, why couldn't you do this with all the palaces, but whatever. Zelda II is not as open as Zelda I. Though there is some exploration to be done, progress is a lot more streamlined and linear than before, as you'll need to acquire certain items in order to progress onwards. This isn't necessarily a bad thing since it gives you more of a focus on where to go and how to proceed, but it does feel a lot more restrictive in what you could do, especially compared to the first game, which was a lot more open-ended and could be tackled in any way. For better or worse, this semi-linear progression would be adopted for most Zelda games going forward. Also, compared to its predecessor, Zelda II is a challenging little game to an almost frustrating degree. Like I said, a large part of the game is focused on combat, and for its part, the sword play is pretty solid. Alternating between blocking attacks and returning the favor is part of the challenge. Once you nail a certain rhythm, fighting some of these foes end up being a breeze. Thing is, another part of the game that's tied to combat is the grind. The need to accumulate points to build up your status, which is a far more taxing endeavor compared to simply finding new swords and shit to grow stronger. And the grind is something you need to do in order to survive, let alone conquer, the final third or so of the game where the strongest enemies reside and the more devious platforming awaits. It also doesn't help that the game is lacking in the pickups department, not just in terms of inventory items, but in terms of items dropped by foes when you defeat them, which will either be a jar of magic or a bag of points, which means the only way of replenishing health during the heat of things is either through life level ups, collecting heart containers, slapping gems into the temple furniture, or using the life spell to restore your health, assuming you have enough magic to cast the spell to begin with. And if you don't, then you'll have to find jars or kill monsters hoping one will drop a jar, and that means even more grinding. Either way, the trek between towns will be long and treacherous, and there's always the looming cloud hanging above you in that no matter how strong you get to be, there's always someone who's going to be hitting harder, and the knockback per hit is no fun, especially during the platforming bits. Oh yeah, there's quite a bit of platforming here, including some unhealthy bodies of fluid that await you down below. And while Link can make some leaps without much trouble, others not so much, which means needing to use the jump spell. And while I have little to complain about in regards to the sword play, when it comes to the platforming bits, let's just say Link isn't the most nimble hero around these parts, and his basic leaping prowess leaves much to be desired. On the flip side, if you're lucky enough, you could pull off this little trick. Whee! I don't know what happened. I don't know how it happened. I just wiggled the D-pad around and just doing this thing, and I've never had this happen to me before. It's funny as fuck. I'm not gonna lie. Regardless, while the challenge is great and crushing at times, it is never impossible, and anything can be conquered within the means you'll find. And when you beat the game, you don't get a second quest per se that's harder than previously, but you do get to replay the level with any spells and levels you've gained previously carried over to the new game, so that's something, I guess. The Adventure of Link sees a massive graphical improvement over the original Legend of Zelda, with more details and terrain types added to the overworld. Yeah, Link is basically a walking doll in the overworld, but he's a walking doll going through forests, deserts, and even graveyards. No coastlines, however. That's kind of disappointing. With regards to the side-scrolling bits, you have some good-looking monsters, from the moblins to the iron knuckles to those dog things with the clubs and shields. Link and the other humans look pretty good too, even though the civilians have a couple frames of animation to them at most. The scenery is pretty good, even if it's reusing some assets for the various areas you'll explore. And while each palace has similar room layouts, at least they look distinct from each other with different colors and blocks. At least on the NES side. The Famicom version has the palaces look similar, if not outright the same at times. And then there's the audio, which is another divergence between regions. Much like the original game, Zelda II was originally a Famicom Disk System release, which means there's a bunch of digitized noise that people would like to call creature snarls or growls or whatever the case may be. They sound awful. Actually, a lot of the sound effects in the Disk System version are kinda scratchy and grating, and thank fuck the NES version redid those sound effects so they don't sound like shit. But besides that, the Famicom version has slightly different cave music compared to the NES version, and to be honest, the NES version sounds a little better. More bold, more adventurous. The title theme uses digitized samples on the Disk System version, and it sounds fine, I guess. A bit too scratchy for my tastes, but whatever. The boss tune has a longer loop in the NES version. I don't know. Music's fine. Some of the non-sample sound effects are fine. And I kinda prefer Zelda 2's item jingle than the usual one, but that's just me. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is a fine game, albeit one that might not be to everyone's taste. There are things to like about this game. The combat's pretty solid, the use of magic and some role-playing elements being implemented are sound ideas. There's more of a focus on what to do, and hey, being able to interact with other people outside of their creepy caves is a nice thing, but then you've got some spotty platforming, the need for endless grinding, some frustratingly difficult parts, and having to restart at the North Castle after every game over is a pain in the ass. Forget trying to compare this to the rest of the series because that's just a waste of time. The Adventure of Link does its own thing and follows its own beat. And I've always enjoyed Zelda 2, so I could put up with its eccentricities, but others might not, and if that's the case, no worries, plenty of other games in the series that would be more to your liking. But if you could put up with some of the quirks that the game throws at you, then The Adventure of Link might be worth your while if you want a challenging side-scroller. Ultimately, your mileage is going to vary on this one. Oh, I guess not. Never mind then. Time to go home.